It's Tuesday, April 5th, 2022. Welcome to Neighborhood News Studio, the home of citizen journalism. My name is Norman Smith, and I'm honored to introduce John O'Loughlin and Harley Schlanger today, kicking off a great lineup of broadcasting for you here on Neighborhood News Studio and at McDuff Lives 3 and also screamingospreys.com. Good morning, John and Harley.
Good morning. And thank you very much for volunteering. You're looking great in your yellow suit there with your neighborhood news hat. Fantastic. And thanks very much for stepping in. And Harley Schlanger, hello. I'm so glad to have you back. How are things with you today, Harley?
Going pretty well so far, John. Got a busy afternoon ahead of me.
I noticed that you have another interview lined up right after this one, and you've always been busy, though. I haven't known you to slow down.
Well, it's more busy than ever. There's more people who are interested in trying to find out the truth, and since that's what I try to provide, it makes me pretty busy.
Okay, well, let's call you Diogenes then. Your lantern, lighting the path. Yeah. And we appreciate it. It's not a bad metaphor, really. Well, let's start with your major effort for April 9th. The Schiller Institute with Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been organizing and really working hard to put together a serious convocation to create a new security environment for Europe and the world. Update us. Tell us how the outreach is going and what type of event you're planning.
Well, it's looking very good. The topic of the event is the drive to convene a new security architecture and financial architecture, a conference which will bring together leaders from around the world to do that. This is something we've been working on since before the Ukraine crisis, but it became more clear that something like this is needed. So what we've done is as broad an outreach as possible, and it's very exciting who we have as speakers lined up so far. Antonov, the Russian ambassador to the United States, is going to join Helga on the first panel, along with a former Indian ambassador to Russia. We have an official who is in Nelson Mandela's government in South Africa who's speaking, one or two more Indian officials, as it's new for us recently to have the Indians involved, but this is fitting given India's role, which has increased recently with the pressure put on them by Biden and NATO to become part of the anti-China, anti-Russia coalition. And Prime Minister Modi said no, and instead is working with Russia on a very significant financial transaction deal. The Chinese were in Delhi for a meeting. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was in Delhi last week. First time in a couple of years that the leaders of China and India met, going back to their last border clash. And then on the weekend, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was in India. So India, with their agreement to have a financial transaction arrangement with Moscow to exchange rubles and rupees, they're very much at the center of things. So we'll be talking about two basic initiatives. One is a new security architecture, which means giving up the unipolar world, which is pretty much collapsing as we're talking today and has been rejected. There's a great realignment underway internationally. And then secondly, the economic component of that, which is crucial, because you can't have security in the world if you have 2/3 of the world's nations lacking electricity, fresh running water, food insecurity. And so we'll be taking up these various topics, and with the idea to point toward a real summit, an international summit to take these up. So it's pretty exciting. It starts, I think it's 9 a.m. Eastern time this Saturday, and it will be at schillerinstitute.com. You can go to the schillerinstitute.com to register for free. It's an online conference, and that should be quite interesting.
It's quite a panel. I don't know most of them, of course, but the ones that I recognize as very strong and important speakers. You know, Dennis Small. I mean, come on, what an amazing man he is, and when he is part of a program, it makes it somehow more special, because I just, the depth of his historical understanding and the depth of his I mean, he's been an absorber of Lyndon LaRouche's economic and historical and even, everything for his, his whole career, as have you. But I had the great privilege of interviewing him once, and he's one of the great minds of our generation. So, I just wanted to point that out.
Dennis and I came into the LaRouche movement about the same time. He predated me a little bit. But Dennis grew up in Mexico, and he's fluent in Spanish. He's done a lot of work with political leaders throughout Latin America. But Dennis and I did a presentation last Saturday for the Manhattan Project, and it was really quite a special event. If people want to see it, they can go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com and look for the Manhattan Project for last Saturday. It was quite interesting. Dennis is one of the authors of the LaRouche plan for 1.5 billion jobs internationally. And he also worked on the plan that's going to be presented this Saturday for how you can overcome the injustices of the colonial era, as well as overcome the creation of the inflation from the Federal Reserve. John, just a quick aside on that. The website Wall Street on Parade just did an update on the quantitative easing aspect of inflation. And they previously were the only ones besides us who covered the last quarter of 2019, when the repo markets, the repurchase markets, froze up and the Fed had to step in to provide liquidity to keep from having a chain reaction collapse of the banks. And what they reported then was under Dodd-Frank, the Fed has to release their the volume of money they're creating. I think it's 6 quarters in the past. So they have 6 quarters to doctor the figures or cover it up. But when they released the last quarter of 2019, it showed over $13 trillion in that last quarter in short-term loans, which ended up being longer term because they kept rolling them over, because there was a derivative collapse and there was a threat to the whole banking system. Now then, the first quarter of 2020 was just released last weekend. They always release it on a Sunday morning, so it doesn't get much coverage. But Wall Street on Parade does cover it. And what they showed is $27 trillion in short-term loans in the first quarter of 2020. And 6 large global banks got about 70% of that money. And 3 of them aren't even American banks. They're Nomura, Barclays, and BNP Paribas. Those 3 all got $3+ trillion. While if you were a wildcatter or trying to expand your local business or your small and medium enterprise, you were probably cut off from money to the bank, because all of this Fed money was going into the big guys to cover the outstanding debts, which they can't cover on their own. So this is an extremely important factor. And the fact that we're talking about a derivative market, which involves hundreds of trillions of dollars transactions turning over daily, over a quadrillion in various forms of holding, $quadrillion. A chain reaction collapse of that, and there'll be nothing left of the lower Manhattan or the city of London. So that's why they're going with the Great Reset. That's why they're using hyperinflation now to try and lower the debt by getting cheaper dollars for free to pay off old debt. What they should do, and this is LaRouche's proposal, is either cancel or have a moratorium on that debt, then let the speculators eat the losses, not try to bail it out by creating more debt and more debt overload on the banking system in the United States. And by banking system, I mean the broad number of local banks that get no credit, while trillions are going to the three largest ones are Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, and Goldman Sachs. So if people can get it, you can go online and look up Wall Street on Parade. It's had a fascinating series of articles recently on the corruption and what makes this corruption so important. And I know you'll appreciate this, John, because you know the Dulles brothers and the Sullivan and Cromwell and the New York bankers. The New York Fed, the New York Federal Reserve Branch Bank, is the one that issues much of the bailout money. That is owned by four banks primarily, which include JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and I think Bank of America. So they're generating trillions of dollars of credit, so-called American dollars of credit, that then go to those banks and is left on the ledger, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. So that gives you a sense of the internal corruption and why there's such a drive to get the Great Reset in place, and why the Russia-China alliance and the possibility of a new financial system has left them so hysterical, because they're going to be left holding the bag unless they can convince Russia and China to go along with the Great Reset. That was not going to happen, and that's why they're targeting Russia's economy with these economic sanctions and economic warfare.
Like you, I've been fascinated with this and trying to keep up with different points of view. I haven't investigated this two guys named Alexander that go by the Duran, D-U-R-A-N. I think they're European, maybe Greek, but their comments are very interesting. Also, Edward Slavsquad, or Riley Wagaman is his real name. He'll be with me tomorrow morning. He's a young correspondent, an American living in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And I will get a perspective from him tomorrow morning on what's going on. But one of the big issues that I've been thinking about and trying to sort out in my mind is Putin genuinely working on behalf of Russia? Or is he working in concert with some group of Western finance, whether it's the Anglo-American or the more European form of it, maybe based in Switzerland, as has been suggested, that perhaps he has some contacts there and some money there. How do you evaluate the sincerity of Putin? For instance, his famous, now famous speech of the Empire of Lies, and how it looks to me like he's absolutely distancing himself from the Western political system and saying, I'm different. We're doing this for Russia. On the other hand, he's still part and parcel of, from the World Economic Forum's point of view, he's part of what they're doing. And there's indications both ways. How do you read it?
Well, I think it's disinformation that he's going along with the World Economic Forum. If you look at his career, he came in at the end of an 8-year period of incredible looting operations against Russia, the so-called shock therapy doctrine, to transform Russia from a clunky, unworkable Soviet bureaucratic state that nevertheless had certain scientific developments, certain industrial capabilities, but couldn't function because of the Soviet collectivism. The idea of the Americans and the British, especially the City of London and Wall Street, was that there would be a shock therapy transformation to a modern free enterprise economy. Now, that was the story of what they were trying to do, but what they actually did was just loot the country to the bone. They sent in bankers who did surveys of real estate, surveys of the hard economy, buildings, factories, transportation capabilities. What they could transport out of there, they did. They took over the mining interests, they took over nickel, they took over the oil and gas industry, and set up people who became Russian oligarchs as the people who were benefiting from it. But in the period from 94 to 99, Russia started a demographic collapse where the death rate exceeded the birth rate quite substantially. And this was occurring under Yeltsin, who was a drunkard, but Yeltsin brought in around him a team of free market economists. Now, when Putin came in 1999, he had those free market economists there, and Russia was still dependent on a credit system which was not interested in building Russia. So Putin had to figure out a way to work with them. And so in the early years, he was talking all the time about a partnership. You may remember in 2001, after 9/11, the Russians were the first ones to reach out to the United States and say they wanted to work with them. Previously, though, when Clinton was the president and talking to Yeltsin, there was a conference in 1994 in Budapest. And at that one, Clinton came there and said, "Oh, we want you in NATO. We want a peaceful transformation." And meanwhile, his workers in the State Department and the Defense Department were working on an enlargement of NATO, moving NATO eastward, and not including Russia. And when Yeltsin found out about that, he blew up. And William Burns, who's now the CIA director, at that time was working as an NSC director of Russian policy. And he wrote a memo saying that if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO, you have to realize Russia has substantive concerns about this. And he said, we have to ignore their explosive tone on this, but they do have substantive concerns. He said a similar thing in 2008, because the next turning point was 2007, where Putin was quite angered at the meeting where they talked about bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. After Putin in 2007 gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference saying that this would be a threat to Russian security. So in 2008, when they said they would accept the aspirations, if not yet the membership of Ukraine and Georgia, William Burns wrote another memo. This time he was ambassador to Russia. And the title of the memo was "Niet means niet, no means no." Russia, this would be a security problem for Russia, and it would lead to the country breaking up between the Russian-speaking and non-Russian-speaking, possible civil war. And for that reason, this is not a good policy. Now then, go 13 years later. Putin in November and December of last year kept saying, look, we need security guarantees. You've got hot-headed nationalists in Ukraine who are killing the Russian ethnic population, the civilian population in the Donbass, and you're not doing anything about it. We need security guarantees. And then Zelensky goes to the Munich Security Conference and says, well, Ukraine could have the capability of building nuclear weapons. Boom. That left Putin with no option. Now, what's his policy for Russia? His policy is to be a partner with both the West and with China, to be able to have investment capability in new scientific capabilities, new technologies to increase the productivity of labor. They've reversed the demographic collapse. They've reversed the antiquated nature of the scientific and technological sectors of Russia, primarily in the defense and security, but also in other areas. They've become a major wheat exporter, so they've righted their ship. But Putin has not been given the assurances that he was demanding from Western nations. And when people say, well, Putin's working with Klaus Schwab and Davos, that's nonsense. Schwab and his crew are the ones who are now working through the city of London and through the US military industrial complex to destroy Russia. And what was their biggest complaint? The Russia-China Partnership Agreement, especially after February 4th. The idea that Russia and China would form a potential Eurasian European Economic Union, which would be attractive to European countries, which would mean that you could pull France and Germany out of the Great Reset, out of the dollar collapse, and give them investments in physical production in Russia, China, and the Belt and Road Initiative. So for those people who say Putin and Xi are part of the deal, Just look at what's being done to their countries. Look at the slanders against them. Look at the arming of Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. The fact that the West is not even, and by the West, I mean Biden, Boris Johnson, and NATO, are unwilling to even consider doing what Putin asked. Even though Zelensky now says he's willing to accept no membership in NATO for Ukraine, work out some kind of arrangement on the Donbass. Remember, Ukraine signed the original agreement for a negotiated settlement, which they violated repeatedly. So I think people who are still putting this thing out that the Russian Revolution was a Bolshevik operation run by the Rothschilds and that Xi Jinping is an agent of the international banks who are going to make China the center of the world economy, it's just nonsense. Their view is that we need an all-inclusive security and economic capability, but based on national sovereignty. Davos, Schwab, the banks oppose the idea that any nation has a right to veto the policies. So there's a fundamental contradiction between the two sets of alternatives. And what we're doing at the Schiller Institute is trying to create a capability to bring the whole world together around a cooperative activity that would benefit all nations, but sovereign nations, based on the sovereign principle of each nation has a right to choose its own path for development, which is not acceptable to Wall Street and London. And the most recent example of that is the attempt to overthrow the government of Imran Khan in Pakistan through a no confidence vote. What did the Washington Post say his problem is? That his economic policies aren't working? Well, what country has economic policies working besides China? Their main complaint was that he's moving Pakistan out from the Western alliance toward a more favorable relationship with the so-called authoritarians. In other words, those who reject the Wall Street London policy. So this is really the fight that we're seeing internationally. And I get somewhat angry, as maybe you can tell, when I hear people who fall for all kinds of conspiracy theories say, oh, Russia and China are in on it. That's simply not the case. They were in on it. Russia was in on it under Yeltsin and nearly was destroyed. Russia intends to sustain its sovereignty and work with countries that will work with them. And in a moment, I can go through how this realignment is shaping up, because it's really quite breathtaking.
It's incredible, but the fact is that there are people that are absolutely convinced that the goal is a worldwide totalitarian state, and that China and Russia are at the vanguard of creating that world. And when you see the clips of Chinese pedestrians on the street, and then the computer comes in with a little box around their face and says, this is number 63,947. And you understand the desires of the banks to keep track of all transactions, central bank digital currency, those aspects of economic future for people, especially the digital currency aspect, seem to be quite fine with China and Russia. Russia is moving forward with a digital ruble, as I understand it.
But there's a big difference, John. Big difference.
I'm just let me finish the thought.
Go ahead.
My thought is that people here in the United States are triggered by that kind of thing. Like
Right.
when we see that, that 25 million people in Shanghai are on lockdown, total lockdown. They can't even go out and feed the meter or get a sandwich. This is scary. We don't want that in the United States. And that is part of why people are suspicious. That's just my 2 cents worth. I'm nowhere near the expertise to argue or speak to, counter what you just said. I trust that you've done the homework, and you have. And so I'd love to be able to just say, okay, everybody relax, you can trust Putin, but I just can't.
Well, if you look at what Edward Snowden has said, we have the same technologies and the same tracking systems in the United States, in some cases more advanced than the Chinese social credit system. Look what happened in Canada with the people on the truckers' strike. I mean, they actually had their bank accounts stolen in some cases. So, the idea that China and Russia are alone in these kinds of methods is just not true. But there's another difference. The idea of a centralized digital currency would be an automatic global dictatorship. What the question that people have to look at is, what's the purpose of credit? What's the difference between the way China and Russia allocate credit and credit is allocated in the United States? Now, everyone will say, well, we have a free market economy. Yes, but unless you're a big guy, it's very difficult to get a loan these days for a business. Unless you have an insider at Chase or a friend in Chase or Bank of America, you'll pay quite a bit where they're still getting free money. The difference with the credit generation policy in China and Russia is that they direct it. They direct it to physical economic production, which increases the total value added to the whole economy. It doesn't militate against people accumulating money. China's got billionaires, Russia's got billionaires. The standard of living in China has improved for the whole population. In fact, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 2 decades in China by UN and accounting statistics, while in the United States, we're pushing millions of people from the so-called middle class into poverty, to the point that I think the figures now are almost 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So we're going down because our credit is going to speculators and billionaires, whereas the Chinese are putting their credit into new technologies, into industries, into science, into education, classical culture, and education. Now, I'm not in favor of everything China's doing, but what I see is the West is, in the name of freedom of the individual, is destroying the society, destroying the social fabric that enabled us to build a powerful, wealthy country. Whereas the Chinese are embarking on a pathway that's moving in that direction. Now, will China loosen the reins at some point? I think they already have, and I think they will a lot more. And if you look at the polls that are taken, even by Western pollsters, the majority of Chinese people who say they're happy with their situation is much, much higher than here. Now, I know you're going to say, well, if they say they don't like it, they'll get shunted off to a concentration camp.
We love it here. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
the soup is especially good.
Yeah. But if you look at the way the narrative is shaped, it's shaped in such a way to cover the fact that we are moving increasingly toward a dictatorial powers for our government here, including censorship, including confiscation, including the facial recognition and so on, which they have in China. Well, the Chinese are actually increasing the economic benefit to the whole country. Now, that creates a paradox for people who say that what made the United States great was our individual freedom. The question is individual freedom to do what? And the individual freedom, if you have the money, you can do whatever you want. If you don't have money, what's your freedom worth? Freedom to be homeless, freedom to live under whichever bridge you choose. Now, I think that the general welfare clause of the preamble of the Constitution was taken by the founding fathers to mean government should play a role, not top-down control, but to ensure that there's a capability for everyone to maximize their intellectual freedom and their economic freedom. And that requires a certain amount of regulation, because if you don't have it, private, powerful interests will take the freedom away from everyone. Because as we see, they take over the banks, The banks take over the government. That's what synarchism is. So there's a thin line between freedom in a democratic republic and the freedom to do whatever you want with having no power to do much. And that's, I think, what we're talking about. That's the fight that well, that's what people see when they look at Russia and China and say, well, I wouldn't want to live there. And yet some of these are the same people who say they hate the big banks, they hate the power of the corporations. Well, it's those corporations and banks that are trying to destroy the Russian and Chinese economy.
Canada, to me, is not an example of the freedoms that we have in America. I think Canada is much more of a British-controlled, and actually quite a dangerous place to have such a long border with us. So if you look through the history and go back into the 20th century, when the British basically infiltrated not only the FBI but the OSS and the CIA and everything else, and the State Department. So we ended up basically heading back into the British Empire, with them pulling us back with all kinds of techniques, including importing people into our country from Ukraine and Belarus and the other kind of Central European former Pale countries that somehow got laundered through London and became British agents or sleeper agents that we have now. And I speak of somebody like the former Attorney General Barr and other people. I mean, did you know that Arlen Specter, and I just knew this, Arlen Specter is the author of, folks, if you don't know this, of the magic bullet theory. And Arlen Specter, his parents were Ukrainian. And I don't know if that means anything, but it certainly is something that I didn't know. And now all of this Ukrainian stuff coming here, there are now I just saw this publication I followed, Defense Policy or something, and it said the Defense Department, the Navy has said to its private contractors, hire Ukrainian and Afghan refugees when they come here. Okay, hire them. Why hire them? Why don't hire Americans to do things in the defense industry that, are we really now being infiltrated? And are we being infiltrated by agents of this Ukrainian World Economic Forum combination somehow with the City of London? Because, I mean, from my point of view, Harley, the two, Russia and China, have never been free in my lifetime. And I don't think they're free now. But in this country, as you know very well, we wouldn't have had a constitution if we didn't have a Bill of Rights. That was the deal. And so there would not be an America. There wouldn't be a United States of America, but for people like James Madison Jefferson saying, we have a certain sense of inalienable rights. And without those inalienable rights, you didn't have the United States of America. And the people that are here now, I was watching a little YouTube about somebody that described the various populations that came over here. And it's a place, that's a mess if you want to get into it. But one of the themes was that the people that came over from the Scotland, the Jacobites that came over in large numbers, especially to Virginia and North Carolina in the 1800s, these people are still, they're fleeing from that Hanoverian top-down totalitarian state, seeking freedom in Virginia, then Kentucky, then Texas, then, just going further and further towards the idea of, I don't care. I don't need the king's coin. I don't need anything. I've got, my dog and my gun and my woman, and I'm good. So, I mean, that's the mentality.
Sounds like a country song.
It is a country song. That is the mentality. The mentality is I'm good. Don't.
But John, let me just walk back a second to something you said.
Yeah.
Had it not been for Russia, there might not have been a success in the American Revolution, because the Russians were at the core of the group of nations that formed something called the League of Armed Neutrality, that promised that they would break any embargo of goods going to the colonies during the revolution. And that they also, in the form of the French troops and the French weapons that were delivered to the Americans, there were Europeans who continued to support us. Why? Because they didn't like the British Empire. But the Tsarina Catherine was very instrumental, along with Joseph II, the Emperor of Austria, and the Marquis de Lafayette was one of the key figures in France, who worked together as an international group to make sure that we had the opportunity to win the Revolutionary War, so we could draft a constitution and a Bill of Rights. Now, many of the ideas in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights came through Benjamin Franklin, through his studies of a German scientist and philosopher named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. In fact, the idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes from Leibniz, rather than John Locke's life, liberty, and pursuit of property. And that's an important distinction, because what Leibniz said is what you want to have is a nation where people are happy with what they're doing and the work they're doing and the idea they're creating a future. And that really resonated with Franklin, who worked together with Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and others in drafting the founding documents, and then also was realized through Hamilton's economic writings that ensured that the British could not control the credit policy of the United States. And the National Bank of the United States, even though there were Brits who invested in it, the control of it rested with Americans, with government, not with the private bankers, especially not with British private bankers. So the national banks that we had at the founding of our country, which was supported by Washington and the founding fathers, was in direct contrast to the top-down control that the king and the monarchy had over the Bank of England. And by the way, John Locke was one of the, I believe he was a board member of the Bank of England at one point. And so you had this distinction, which is reflected in the documents you're talking about, the Bill of Rights and so on, that this was the idea that you have your freedom, as Franklin said, if you can keep it. You have a republic if you can keep it. And that means the people have to be the ones making the decisions, including how much money we're going to generate, how that money is going to be spent. The Davos crowd is saying that, well, the Federal Reserve controls the volume of money and the credit policy. Now they must control the spending policy as well. That's part of the Great Reset. And that's something that is not going to be accepted by any sovereign nation. It shouldn't be accepted by any American either, because that goes against the precepts that guarantee that we have a capability to act as free people.
You make several very important points, and I agree with what you're saying. I don't think that anything that Russia did or can do in the future will change the fact that part of the American dream is the Bill of Rights, and we have a Bill of Rights, and we're not going to give it up. If we are given the opportunity. Let me try this. What do you think about a kind of a Russian doll sense of control? And this is my idea. Just hit me. Think of it as a little bitty, the individual as the tiniest Russian doll in the doll set, and he's in the middle and he's in control of himself and his body. And then the next one might be, say, his family, and then the next one his school community where his kids go to school, or a local community. And the next one maybe a province or a county, and then the state, and then the government. But in terms of if something doesn't affect, if something is basically a question of what goes on with me and my body, then I am the sovereign. And then if it's about my family, then my family is the sovereign. And if it's about my community, then my community needs to get together and have a meeting and decide what they want to do. And if necessary, form a militia to make sure that, you don't get your rights taken away. But to me, if the opposite of top-down government would be this idea of I have certain rights and privileges that are me, that is inalienable. And that's Jefferson's word. And I wonder if I hope Leibniz also used the word inalienable, because without that, then you can just say, well, we'll change your human rights because we're the
your
government.
rights are given to you from someone else. Yeah,
right.
But John,
that's what I would say is that those of us probably, if you want a real hard look at the January 6th crowd, that's the bottom line. And who is it? Was just a minute ago on the chat room, Jimmy Beam, I think it was, that said, all we want is to be left alone. Just leave us alone and we'll all be happy. So, just leave us alone as far as, things like healthcare, for instance. I can't see the American people giving in to a totalitarian approach to things that have to do with, especially when now we have so much suspicious misinformation and things, Fauci's turning out to have, talked out of both sides of his mouth and all that. I mean, why should we trust, who is Mr. Science, and why should we trust Mr. Science? And if we can't, like, is there really a pandemic going on in China that really needs them to shut down 50 million people into their homes? Or is this just an exercise in political power to see if they can do it? How do we know which one it is without free speech? What free speech is something that I think is my right as an individual to just say, here's what's on my mind. Here's my conscience. I want to share this with my fellow citizens. And if I can't do that on YouTube, that means that I've been deprived my freedom of speech. If I persist doing it on YouTube and my social credit card score goes down and they start sucking money out of my bank account, that's what I'm afraid of. That's what I'm afraid of, is that or they'll come around and knock on the door and say, you got to go to the re-education camp. Eric Prince is looking for you.
Well, John, I would say two things. I think your approach in terms of the individual, the family, the community, that's fine. That's legitimate. And it is something that is protected by our Constitution and by the traditions of our nation. But at the same time, if you don't have a national mission that provides for that to be protected, then you have problems.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we began to see emerging around the Trump phenomena was the idea that we have to have one national mission as opposed to identity politics. Because if you go too far breaking things down so that everybody has what they want and what their group wants, you end up creating conflicts that have to be resolved. Then do you resolve them by duels? Do you resolve them by having a court system that's based on principles of law that have been established and worked out over decades, if not centuries? Do you have a government which can protect the country from foreign or private takeover? Now, what we had something, just as an example of this, a bill passed in 1933 called Glass-Steagall, which addressed a problem that was responsible in large part for the Great Depression of the 29 to 35, 36 period, which is allowing the speculators, which at that time was through the Federal Reserve, allowing the speculators to control the credit, currency, debt, to create monopoly trusts and use that to limit individual freedom. Now, they use the argument of we should be free to borrow as much as we want from the government and invest it however we wish. But they did it to increase their control over every aspect of economic life. So Glass-Steagall was not just Franklin Roosevelt's bill. It was actually put in place before Roosevelt came in, but he pushed it through. And he used the Pecora Commission hearings to show the corruption of the conglomerates, the financial conglomerates working at that time with utilities. If you lived in a rural area and there wasn't enough money coming out of it for a bank to invest in providing electricity, you couldn't get electricity. And the Rural Electrification Bill enabled millions of people to have access to electricity through the idea of public utilities. Now, was that a violation of individual rights or an extension of individual rights? And these were the debates that were going on during the New Deal. And the argument against Glass-Steagall, which said you can either be an investment bank or a mortgage bank, an investment bank or a commercial bank. And if you're an investment bank, you can't use your client's money for your gambling. And if you do, you lose it, you lose it. You don't get bailed out. There was a wall of separation between commercial and investment banks. That was taken down successively from 1971 until it was finally repealed in 1999. Democrats and Republicans, under the idea of free market policy, opposed it. It was drafted by 3 Republicans led by Phil Gramm, an imbecilic senator from Texas, but it was signed by Bill Clinton under the advice of the corrupt Robert Rubin, who was his Treasury Secretary and economic advisor. And what did it do? It allowed the growth of the so-called universal banks that could siphon money from the government from various kinds, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, various agencies for housing, but then create completely giant bubbles out of artificial financial instruments. Now, that's what was done under maximum freedom for banking. So we need to go back to a regulation. It doesn't mean the government controls who a bank can loan money to. That's not the American system. In the American system, if you become a banker and you have a fiduciary responsibility for the money that's invested in your bank, you'd better abide by the law, but it's your decision whether you loan to Farmer Jones over here or to an industrial company or to both of them. Now, that's where we have to have, I would say, an education in how the American economy was built. And that's an example of where a right to regulate is legitimate. The over-regulation is a problem, and that's what we have to keep an eye on. And that's why we have freedom of speech and right to free assembly and so on, to be able to protest if that's infringed on. But to say that everything goes when you have individuals with so much power that they can dictate the terms to the government, which is what's happening with this Great Reset and the Green New Deal, that's when you run into problems. And so there's always been a balance in the United States, which has been, for the most part, successful, between the protection of individual rights by a government, but at the same time, the people being watchdogs to make sure that government is not controlled by private interests, whose private interests required that they take away your freedom. That's why we have to be eternally vigilant.
I don't know if you know this book, but I was reading it last night on my show, and we're talking all about John Locke. This is called The Kennedy Assassination Cover-Up by Don Gibson. And he talks all about, he said, I think what my point is that that default toward individual rights and freedom was lost with the Kennedy assassination. That would be my response to you. And that he says Kennedy and McCloy, who you know, John J. McCloy, were working for opposite visions of government.
Mm-hmm.
And that McCloy was working for the John Locke vision. And I love the distinction between the pursuit of happiness, which is what, you know, I love and I want our country to perpetuate, and the pursuit of property. And, you know, that is the difference, because the Locke system is that if you got property, the government's going to do everything they can to make sure you keep your property. You're going to be getting more property, and we're going to screw the common people to make sure that you never lose your elite status. That's the idea I get from John Locke as as summarized by Donald Gibson in that book. But
that's very interesting, John, because this is the philosophical debate that was going on at the time of the American Revolution. Imagine in the bar rooms and the taverns in the 1770s and 1780s debating the Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, as opposed to fantasy football or, the Will Smith slapdown. The founding fathers created a discussion group. Franklin, in fact, set up the American Philosophical Society and he set up the post office so they could send letters back and forth to have these debates if they weren't in the same city. Mm-hmm. We don't have that. We have so much communication capability with email and Twitter and everything else, but so little idea content. And that's the revolution that was made in the United States, was over these discussions of how do you keep a country together and defend it from foreign and domestic enemies without abridging the liberties that you come together to protect. That's what we have to be discussing. And that's why at our conference this weekend, we're going to be discussing a security architecture that protects and defends the interests of individual sovereign states. And those states have a responsibility to protect the individual interests of the citizens of those states. And then that's what you debate through your legislatures, how to best do that, instead of letting the bankers and the health insurance companies and everyone else come in over the top and say, here's what you're going to do.
1971, George P. Shultz, the gold standard, off the gold standard, the philosophy of our economy switched from the productive system to the speculative system. And in comes all the money laundering, the dirty money comes into our system, and it's just a cesspool now of dirty money and bad
influence peddling.
Yeah, what did you call it?
Influence peddling.
Influence
buying and selling the Congress.
Yeah. While they're diluting the value of the dollar as we speak, that's how they're ripping us off. It's a hidden tax, and we're all going to be poorer by the end of this year, just as a result of inflation. But that is I think the key that I'm taking away from this discussion today is credit policy.
Yeah.
That is, are you lending money on the Green New Deal? And that seems to be what you and all of your colleagues have convinced me, that the new system is to lend money only to the Green New Deal people and not to productive people, not to people that want to build manufacturing and communities and make it a successful country again. We've lost our purple mountains and our amber waves of grain, Harley. It's all gone. The grain is in Russia, the mountains are in the Caucasus, and all the minerals and the food is no longer here, along with the shipping out of our industry to China and everything else. So credit policy has to be reversed, and we have to have a strong enough government that can enforce what you call the Hamiltonian system, the American system, the Kerry system. And I've learned so much from you, Harley, about that, and you're right. That's what we need. So I better wrap it up here.
People can learn more by tuning into our conference this Saturday, the SchillerInstitute.com, and this is what we'll be discussing with people from all over the world.
Okay, and there it is right there on the bottom of our screen. Well, that's it for this morning from us here at McDuff, and we turn it all back over to Norman at Neighborhood News Studio in Michigan. Harley Schlanger out there in Potsdam, Germany. We thank you very, very much from the bottom of our heart for your dedication and sharing with us.
See you soon.
All right, we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, John and Harley. That was a fascinating discussion of current events and the implications of history. You can follow John at McDuff Lives 2 and 3 on YouTube, and follow Harley at the LaRouche Organization. And now we will be switching over. Those of you that are following this on YouTube can hop over to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com and follow the rest of today's programming. We've got the George Webb Research Roadshow, some review of Mark Kulak's work. From 4 to 5, we'll be talking with Chris Hunter. And from 5 to 6, we've got Peter Duke.
Now let's look at a couple of aspects of the economy. There are actually two reports from the Federal Reserve which are interesting given the acceleration of inflation and the overall global economic weakness. One is a report from the US Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, which asks a question of why is US consumer price index inflation higher than in other countries? And they conclude it's due to the policies of zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and providing money for both bailouts and increased government spending. They said this has added at least 3% to inflation. Now, our perspective, our analysis shows that actually almost all of the inflation is due to the bailouts. And this can be seen in a second report that came from the Federal Reserve. This is a report mandated by the Dodd-Frank bill, which requires, after a passage of time, reports on what was done 5 quarters or 6 quarters earlier. We had in the beginning of this year, the report on the first, actually it was on New Year's Eve, so no one would see it. And in fact, it got no coverage. But the report on the last quarter of 2019, which showed that $13 trillion was pumped into the banking system by the Federal Reserve after the September freeze